How's it going, folks? Dave Brown here with the New Populist. Thank you again for joining me. So recently, Robert Kennedy Jr. Announced that he would challenge Joe Biden for the Democrat Party nomination in 2024. And as you can imagine, the news barely acknowledged this. Of course, the mainstream media is in the pocket of the establishment, and they are fully behind Joe Biden. And they do not want to see a challenger like RFK Jr. Now, RFK Jr. is an interesting fellow. There are things that he supports that I'm 100% behind, and there are things that I do not support. But I do think that he's an honest fellow, that he has the best interest of the country at heart, and he's not a soulless goon that's half brain dead like Joe Biden. So if he were to get this nomination somehow and Donald Trump was not the Republican nominee, he would easily get my support in a general election. Now, what's funny about his announcement is that it's in some ways mirrors his own father's situation back in the 1960s, where he challenged a sitting Democrat president for the nomination. And back in '67, Robert Kennedy Sr. gave an interview with Face the Nation, and a lot of the issues he talked about are still relevant today. And when you hear him talk, you really go, man, the United States missed out big time on having him become president. And it does make you wonder who exactly was behind his murder, besides the obvious person who pulled the trigger. Because what he wanted to do, what he was saying, if he said today, in the current circumstances with the Ukraine war and China, he would have the same target on his back. And people who do speak out against what's happening in Ukraine, as far as the United States support in NATO, are treated a lot like him and other people were back in the 60s, who were challenging the war in Vietnam. And he, of course, he said early on that he did support it, but he realized he made a mistake, and he wanted to rectify that bit by rethinking U.S. policy. So who took out JFK or RFK? Well, both of them. Probably the CIA or elements nearby. But I wanted to play a couple of clips from this interview from Face the Nation in 1967, because I think for people, especially young people today, who haven't seen him, I think it really would show you something as far as the fact that we have the same issues in this country. And there was a time when we had politicians who really were well-spoken. They thought about what they were saying, and there was some real compassion in his voice and in his message on this broadcast that is devoid from our modern day politicians. So I want to play a few clips and comment on them, and it's really, again, interesting to see what he has to say. So here's the first clip.
I think that one of the great problems that we're having at the moment is the fact that we're not really having much of a dialogue about some of these matters. That's why I said a week or so ago that it's possible that if Eugene McCarthy declares and comes into and decides to enter some of these primaries, there will at least be a discussion. I think one of the problems in the country at the moment is the fact that there isn't communication between races and between various groups in the country, that there is no real dialogue about Vietnam really anymore, that we've taken to the streets, that there's violence, that there's lawlessness, that we frequently won't let those who disagree with us speak. I think that not only the Democratic Party suffers, but the whole country suffers, and our society suffers. And I think that it's within the Democratic Party that we should have dissent. I don't think that the dissent here in the United States, or those who disagree, should be confined to those who are young. I think that when we sign up for the Democratic Party, we don't say that we're never going to disagree. I think that there's much to disagree about. I mean, we've done a great deal within this country, but there's also much to disagree about. And there is much more that we can do, and there's much more that we can do, in my judgment, not only in Vietnam, but in other parts of the world that we're not doing. And I'm going to continue to talk about those matters.
Well, how about that? No dialogue, not allowing other people to speak. Now, who exactly right now is running around preventing people from speaking? And I'm sorry, liberals, Democrats, right now it's generally you whether it be shouting down speakers on college campuses. If there's a rally, you come in there and you start problems, getting people thrown off Twitter. So the attack on free speech and not letting people speak, that is happening in spades today. So somebody like RFK, who was a Democrat, if he were alive today, how would he be treated by the Democrat Party? And for you liberals out there, that's something to think about. People were right to protest against the Vietnam War, and should they have been shouted down or should they have been prevented from speaking? So even if you support this war in Ukraine and you support NATO in this effort, there is room, or there should be room, for other opinions without being accused of being a Putin puppet. It is such a intellectually lazy thing to do. Just call somebody a Putin puppet. It's beneath you, honestly, or it should be beneath you to make that sort of argument and make those sort of accusation to somebody simply for having a different opinion on the matter. So for Democrats, again, think about what you're doing today as far as free speech and not allowing dissent within the party. Let me get to the next clip.
Turn to the war and politics in a different way. Do you think that this administration, the administration of President Johnson, can conclude a peace in Vietnam?
Yes, I think it's possible.
When? Could it be during this election year?
Well, I think it's more difficult. I think that it's possible to do. I think that the indications over the period of the last few weeks are that we're just going to go in the military field and that we're not going to go to the negotiating table. I think that under those circumstances we will continue with the military effort, and I think that that's going to get the casualties will continue to rise on both sides, in my judgment.
Now, it's interesting here that he mentions going to the negotiating table and not doing that, and instead ramping up the military part of this war. And what has been missing from our current Ukraine crisis? The willingness to negotiate. And right now, the United States simply will not do that. The Russians have tried repeatedly to negotiate early on in the war. I think it was April 2022. They were negotiating with the Ukrainians until the West came in and basically said to the Ukrainians, cut them off. No more talking. And since then, probably close to 200,000 Ukrainians have been killed. So why can't we negotiate? Just like in Vietnam. Don't negotiate. Okay, now X amount of people will die over the next 5 years. And what happened anyway? We withdrew from Vietnam. How many lives would have been saved if we simply tried to talk? And what they do to try to prevent dialogue or negotiating is to compare everything to the Nazis, right? Where if you negotiate, or if you let the Nazi presence to continue to exist, it's going to threaten the entire world. So that's their strategy. That's what they do. Compare it to the Nazis to try to undermine your ability to argue for any sort of negotiation. That is their tactic, and they use it over and over and over again. Let's go to the next clip.
Senator, what is your view of the current form of dissent in this country? Do you find it healthy in all its aspects?
No, I don't. I mean, I think some of it where it turns to violence, I think makes there's a point to the demonstration in front of the Washington Monument. People disagreeing with our position in Vietnam. There's a point for those who feel that we should do more and demonstrate as they do. But when it gets to violence, and when it gets to walking around and committing acts of terrorism, and when it goes to not permitting another person to speak, as they have not Vice President Humphrey or Secretary Rusk, I think it's a very, very bad mistake. But I just think it's a very, very bad mistake.
Just recently, there has been an emphasis within this administration on the fact that this war is being fought in the American national security interests because of a great threat
Yes.
from Asian communism and so forth. Now, if that is the case, it would follow that perhaps we ought to do as much as
Yes.
needed to be done. And would you address yourself to that? In whose interest is this war?
Well, I think first we were there. First going to your point that I've been involved in this, and as I say in my book, I have a share of responsibility, and if there are mistakes that have been made, I've been involved in those mistakes. But perhaps if you admit mistakes, you're perhaps a little wiser than you were when you were committing them. But
Could you be specific about
well, could I just answer
mistakes on Vietnam?
I'll answer the first on Mr. Wicker's question, because I think this really is extremely important for us. First, we were making the effort there so that people had their own right to decide their own future and could select their own form of government, and it wasn't going to be imposed on them by the North Vietnamese, and we had the support of the people of South Vietnam. I think that's why we were involved in that struggle. That's certainly as the way I looked at it when I was in President Kennedy's administration and when I was with President Johnson. Now we've turned when we found that the South Vietnamese haven't given the support and are not making the effort. Now we're saying we're going to fight there so that we don't have to fight in Thailand, so that we don't have to fight on the west coast of the United States, so that they won't move across the Rockies. But our whole moral position, it seems to me, changes tremendously. One, we're in there, we're helping people. We're working with them. We're fighting for their independence. Second, we're killing the enemy, and we're also killing many civilians, but we're doing it because they want it. Now we've changed and we switched. Maybe they don't want it, but we want it. So we're going in there and we're killing South Vietnamese, we're killing children, we're killing women, we're killing innocent people because we don't want to have the war fought on American soil, or because they are 12,000 miles away and they might get to be 11,000 miles away. Our whole moral position changes, it seems to me, tremendously. I mean, do we have the right here in the United States to say that we're going to kill tens of thousands, make millions of people as we have, millions of people refugees, kill women and children as we have? There's 35,000 people without limbs in South Vietnam, 150,000 civilian casualties every year. Thousands of children are killed because of our efforts. Do we have that right here in the United States to perform these acts because we want to protect ourselves so that we don't have, it's not a greater problem for us here in the United States? I very seriously question whether we have that right.
I find that last clip to be absolutely fascinating for several reasons. First, RFK said something that you never hear anymore, and that is a politician saying, we've made mistakes. I've been part of those mistakes, but we need to learn from those mistakes so we can make better decisions in the future. Today, politicians, they double down, they triple down. They never admit that what they did was a mistake. And you look at the Iraq War, the neocons, even today, they hold on saying, oh, no, that was good. Maybe our intelligence was wrong, but our hearts were in the right place. Because if you want to trust anybody's heart, it's a neocon's heart. They're good people who just start wars because, because it's in the interest of the world for freedom and democracy. And that's why they do it. Of course, that's BS. So the fact that RFK talks about being wrong is fantastic. And clearly he understood in 1967 that what we were doing in Vietnam was not working, and there was it was time to change course. Now, the next thing he said is the reasoning for being in Vietnam keeps changing. He said originally it was about the South Vietnamese deciding their own future and deciding their own government. And that's why we were supporting them, kind of like Ukraine. We're just there so the Ukrainians can decide their own future, pick their own government, and have the democracy. And we're just helping them do that. That's why we're doing it. But that's changed. Like he said, it went from that in Vietnam to this is in the national security interest of the United States to keep fighting this war. We're fighting them over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. That if we don't stop them there, at some point in the future, they're going to be storming the beaches of California, bringing their evil communist army to our shores. Again, we've heard that a million times since then, that we're fighting them over there so they don't fight over here. And just like Ukraine, it went from we're just helping this Zelensky government to decide its own future to, if we don't stop the Russians, they're going to march across Europe and be a threat to the entire world, which of course is nonsense because this conflict is essentially a civil war, and Russia has no capability or no reason to want to go past Ukraine. All they wanted was that part of the Donbass where you had the people there who were Russian speakers who were not happy with the Zelensky government, which of course had the support of the United States, and the previous president was overthrown with the help of the United States. So what's happening in eastern Ukraine is not a imperialist march of the Russians. It's a much more complicated thing. But again, it started off with, we're just trying to help the Ukrainians decide their future, to, okay, well, if we don't do it, we're going to fight the Russians somewhere else, and this is a global threat, and the United States has to stand up to them to prevent this threat from getting bigger. So Vietnam, Ukraine, same old story. And RFK back then was saying the same thing a lot of us are saying today. And people today who speak up and say these things about Ukraine, they're called Putin puppets, Putin apologists, traitors, to get really nasty. And my message is, it's the same old thing. When are we going to learn? And for you young people out there with this Ukraine war who are supporting it with your flags and your bios, we already did this 60 years ago. And then we went to Iraq and Afghanistan. One failure after another, with the same lies being used to justify those wars. So think back. Look at what RFK is saying and ask yourself, does this seem like an honest man who's actually trying to help his country? Or do you think the more honest man, the humble man, is Joe Biden? I mean, it's preposterous to make that comparison. And the last part of that clip, you heard him talking about our right to cause the death of civilians and get people killed for our goals. And he says, do we have that right? Is this not evil? Well, I don't think it went that far. But that was his point. We're killing all these people because we decided it was in our interest. And who are we to make that call? So how many civilians died in Vietnam? Hundreds of thousands. How many people died in Iraq because of our invasion? I think the number is about 400,000. And what I always think about with these wars is, think about 9/11. We lost 3,000 Americans, and how devastating it was for our country. How it changed everything. 3,000 Americans. Now think about, again, Iraq, 400,000 Iraqis. Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Vietnam, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese. Did we ever stop to think about how impactful it is for those countries to lose that many people because of wars that we participated in? We don't. It's over there. It's not that important to us. We don't treat it the same. And we as Americans, we ought to look at those countries with the same compassion as we look at ourselves. They're human beings too. And if imagine Americans, imagine if 500,000 U.S. civilians died in some sort of war, how absolutely devastating that would be for our country. But because we're so wealthy, because we're protected by the Atlantic Ocean, by the Pacific Ocean, Americans, we don't understand true war and true suffering. We got a taste on 9/11, and that was very scary for a lot of people. But for a lot of countries across the world, suffering is part of their lives. We have a cakewalk here. And all we have to do in America, really, is just to watch and mind our own business. We have everything we could possibly want. Yet for some reason, we allow these neocons, these neoliberals to continue this foreign policy of war and destruction of other countries. And we don't give it our full attention and really think about what we're doing. And despite all the evidence of the mistakes they make and the fact that all their justifications prove to be wrong, we keep letting them do it over and over and over again. And that's what frustrates me. So unfortunately, we don't have RFK today. but we do have RFK Jr., and I hope he gets traction. And for you liberals out there, my God, RFK versus Joe Biden, it should be a no-brainer. But just like Joe Biden, it seems like a lot of liberals have no brains, so they will continue to support him. But let's watch, let's hope, and we'll see if he gets any traction. Well, that's it for now. If you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.